Three men on horseback blocked the road. The one in front, a broad-shouldered rancher named Cal Dutton, didn't even bother getting down from his saddle. He looked at the broken wagon, at the woman standing beside it in the snow, at her three children pressed against her sides, and he laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a deliberate one. The kind a man makes when he wants you to know exactly where you stand. "Turn it around," he said. "Holloway widows aren't welcome past this point." Martha didn't answer. She was holding her youngest against her chest, and the boy's lips had gone the color of ash. Dutton leaned forward in the saddle. "You deaf or just stupid? The pass is closed, and even if it wasn't—" He looked her up and down with the slowness of a man who knew he had all the time in the world. "Nobody's hauling that through my valley." His two men snickered. Martha pulled her coat tighter around her son, and somewhere behind the falling snow, a horse's hooves broke the silence. If that moment made your blood boil, good. Stay with us. This story isn't over. Hit that like button, drop your city and country in the comments below so we can see how far this story travels, and follow the channel so you never miss what happens next. Now let's go back to where it all started. The wagon had been dying for 2 days before it finally gave out. Martha Holloway knew the signs the way a farmer knows rain, not from any single thing, but from the accumulation of small disasters. The left rear wheel had been pulling wrong since they crossed the creek outside of Belden. She told herself it was the mud, then the cold, then the uneven road. She told herself a lot of things over the past 3 months, because the alternative to telling yourself things was sitting down in the snow and not getting back up. The wheel broke completely on the afternoon of the second day, somewhere on the lower face of the Sentinel Range, where the road narrowed into a ledge between rock face and drop-off, and the wind came down from the peaks in long flat sheets that cut through wool like it was gauze. She had $4.60 to her name. She had 3 children: Thomas, who was 11 and trying very hard to act like he wasn't afraid; Clara, who was 8 and hadn't spoken much since her father died; and the youngest, a boy named Ellis, 5 years old and running a fever that had started 2 nights ago and hadn't broken since. She had a crate of dry goods, 2 blankets, a cast-iron pot, her late husband's hunting knife, and a family Bible she'd stopped opening 3 weeks after the funeral. What she did not have was anyone who cared. The road through the Sentinel Range was a migration road. In summer it ran thick with wagons, livestock, circuit preachers, land speculators, and the particular breed of hopeful fool that the American West generated in such impressive numbers. But this wasn't summer. This was late November, the mountains already locked under their first serious snow, and the road was as empty as a church on Monday morning. Empty, that is, except for Cal Dutton and his men. She'd seen them coming from a distance and felt the shape of the problem before she could name it. 3 riders moving too deliberately. No hurry, no purpose, beyond the act of moving toward her. Dutton she recognized. Everyone in the county knew him by his horses, if not his face, and his horses were the finest in the valley. Quarter horses with legs like table legs, moving through snow as if it offended them. He'd pulled up 20 feet short of the wagon, and the conversation she'd already replayed twice in her mind had happened exactly as she'd feared. "Turn it around." She hadn't turned it around. She also hadn't moved forward, because the wheel was broken and the road was iced, and she had nowhere to turn anything around to. She'd just stood there while Cal Dutton laughed at her sun burning up against her chest, and she'd thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to have absolutely no options. Dutton and his men had ridden away slowly, which was somehow worse than if they'd ridden away fast. The slowness said, "We're not worried about you. We never were." Martha set Ellis down on the wagon bed, tucked the blanket around him, and turned to Thomas. "I need you to stay with your brother." Thomas looked at her with his father's eyes. Dark, careful, always measuring something. "Where are you going?" "To figure out what's next." "There's nothing next," he said quietly. Not cruelly, just the way an 11-year-old says a true thing when he's been carrying it for too long. "Thomas, I'm not complaining. I'm just saying what's real." She put her hand on his face, briefly, the way she used to when he was smaller. "What's real is we're still here. Stay with your brother." She walked to the front of the wagon and assessed the wheel. The hub had cracked clean through, which meant it wasn't a fix. It was a replacement. And they didn't have a replacement. What they had was a broke-down wagon on a mountain road with night coming on and a fever that wasn't going to wait for morning. She was still crouching in the snow, staring at the broken hub, when she heard the sound. One horse, moving at a walk, coming from the uphill direction, which meant from deeper in the mountains, not from the valley below. Martha stood. The rider emerged through the snow like something from a story someone else was telling. He was big, not tall exactly, but substantial, the kind of man who seemed to occupy more physical space than his dimensions should allow. He wore a sheepskin coat that had seen serious weather, a hat pulled low, and on his face was the particular expression of a man who has trained himself over many years not to show much. He slowed when he saw the wagon, stopped when he saw her. For a long moment they just looked at each other. "Wheel?" he said. "Hub," she said. He climbed down without being asked, looped his horse's reins over the wagon board, and crouched to look at the damage. He didn't say anything for a while. She watched him look at the crack, then at the road, then at the sky, which was doing nothing good. "Children?" he said. "3. One's sick." He straightened and looked at her directly for the first time. He had gray eyes, the kind that didn't warm up fast. "How sick?" "Fever, 2 days." He didn't ask what she was doing alone on a mountain road in November with 3 children and a broken wagon. She appreciated that more than she could say. "My ranch is 4 miles up," he said. "I can take the sick one on the horse. You'll have to walk with the others." 4 miles. Roads sheltered most of the way. There's a rock wall that cuts the wind. He paused. "It's that, or stay here. I wouldn't stay here." "No," she agreed. "Neither would I." His name was Silas Boone, and she learned it an hour later when they reached the ranch, and he said it to her while she was standing in his kitchen trying to remember what warm felt like. He said it the way men say their names when they're not sure what else to say, plainly, without decoration, as an offering of some kind. "Martha Holloway," she said. He nodded and put a kettle on. The ranch was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. It was solid. The house, the barn, the outbuildings all looked like they'd been built to last through things that weren't supposed to be survived. But it was neglected in the way of a place where one person has been doing the work of 3. Dishes stacked but not washed. Firewood stacked but floors unswept. A table with papers spread across it that hadn't been organized in some time. A man living alone inside his own particular order. She settled Ellis near the fire. His breathing was shallow and fast, but the color in his lips was already coming back from ash to something closer to pink. Thomas sat beside him, straight-backed and watchful. Clara pressed herself against the wall near the door. Not frightened exactly, just taking the measure of things, which was what Clara always did. Silas came back with the kettle and a tin mug and set them on the table near Martha without making a production of it. "There's a room in the back," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's dry." "We won't be a burden," she said, and heard how hollow it sounded the moment it left her mouth. The kind of thing you say because you've been told to say it, not because it means anything. Silas looked at her steadily. "I didn't say you would be. People usually—" "I don't usually." She stopped. He picked up his hat from the table and turned toward the door. "I'll see to your wagon in the morning. If the snow holds off, I might be able to salvage it." "Mr. Boone." He turned. "What? Why?" she said. "You don't know me." He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, which surprised her. She'd expected a dismissal or a platitude. Instead, he said, "Because it was the right thing, and it was in my path." Then he went outside. Thomas looked at her from across the room. "He seems all right," he said carefully. "Don't get comfortable," she said automatically. But she was already looking at the fire and thinking, for the first time in weeks, that maybe they would make it through the night. The morning arrived gray and indifferent, the way mornings do when the weather hasn't decided yet. Martha was up before anyone else. She'd slept in the room Silas had indicated, 4 walls, a rope bed, 1 window. And she'd slept the way you sleep when your body has simply had enough of being awake. Deep, black, dreamless. She woke with her heart pounding for no reason she could identify and lay there in the cold dark for a few seconds, listening to her children breathe. Ellis's fever had broken sometime in the night. She'd checked him 3 times in the dark, her hand on his forehead, and on the 3rd check he'd been cool and damp with sweat, and she'd nearly cried from the relief of it. She rose and dressed in the dark and went to find the kitchen. Silas wasn't there. She could hear him outside, the sounds of early ranch work, axe falling on wood, the stomp and shift of horses in the barn. She stood in his kitchen for a moment, looking at the state of things, and then she started a fire in the stove and found the coffee and put water on to boil. While the water heated, she looked through his stores. He was better provisioned than she'd feared. Sacks of dried beans and flour, smoked meat, root vegetables in a cellar box, dried herbs hanging from a ceiling beam. Enough to last a hard winter if managed carefully. She made coffee and started on breakfast. She was at the stove when Silas came in, stomping snow from his boots. He stopped when he smelled the coffee. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "You want eggs?" He looked at the skillet, then at her. "I have eggs?" "In the cellar box, back left corner, about a dozen. They won't last much longer if you don't use them." He stared at her. "I'm not snooping," she said. "I was taking stock of my kitchen, of what you have. If we're going to be here a few days, someone ought to know what's there." He pulled out the chair and sat down slowly, the way a man does when something is tilted slightly off his understanding of how things work. Most people ask before they go through another man's stores. Most people ask before they take in a strange family in a blizzard, she said, turning the eggs. I figured we'd already moved past the asking stage. There was a silence. Then, from somewhere behind her, she heard him make a sound, almost too short to be a laugh, but not quite. "Fair enough," he said. She brought the eggs and a cup of coffee and set them in front of him and went back to the stove. "The wagon's a loss," he said, after a while. "I know. The hub's not the only thing. The axle's showing cracks. It was going to go soon regardless." "I know that too," she said. "I just needed it to hold a little longer." "Where were you headed?" She hesitated. Not because it was a secret, but because saying it out loud made it more real than she'd been letting it be. "Prospect Creek. My husband's cousin has a homestead there. He wrote that we could come." "Wrote when?" "April." Silas was quiet for a moment. 7 months is a long time. You know if the offer still stands?" "No," she said honestly. "But you came anyway." "I didn't have anywhere else to go." She said it without drama, without asking for anything. Just a fact, laid flat on the table like an unpolished stone. Silas drank his coffee and didn't respond immediately, and she was grateful for that too. She didn't want sympathy. She'd had enough of sympathy. People pressing her hands and making sounds of commiseration, and then going home to their warm houses and their whole families and not thinking about her again. What she wanted was something she couldn't quite name, something useful. "Prospect Creek is 40 miles past the pass," he said finally. "Pass won't clear until March." "I know." "So you'd need to stay somewhere until then." "I know," she said again. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not asking you to leave," he said carefully. "I'm just saying the math out loud. I'm not expecting charity, Mr. Boone. If we stay here, if you'll have us, I'll work. I can cook, clean, mend, keep books if you need it. My children are young, but they're not useless. Thomas can do real work. Claire's good with animals. Ellis?" She paused. "Ellis will be himself again by tomorrow." Silas looked at her for a long moment. That same direct measuring look that didn't warm up fast, but that she was starting to think was genuine attention rather than coldness. "What did your husband do?" he asked. The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was specific. Most people asked what happened to him, not what he did. "Ran a small farm. Better with ideas than with labor, if I'm being honest." She paused. "He was a kind man, not always practical." "And the farm?" "Sold to cover the debts." She scraped the skillet. "That's the short version." "You don't have to give me the long one." "I know," she said. "I might anyway, eventually. People do out here. Run out of things to talk about and start telling the truth." This time she heard it clearly. A short, surprised laugh, quickly contained. She didn't turn around. She let him have it, quietly. Thomas was up within the hour, then Clara, then Ellis, moving slowly but upright, his eyes bright with the specific brightness of a child whose fever has broken and who is now intensely interested in being somewhere new. "What's that?" he asked, pointing at a coil of rope hanging on the wall near the door. "Lasso rope," Silas said. He'd come back in from a second round of chores and was pulling off his coat. Ellis looked at it with profound respect. "Can you use it?" "I can." "Can you show me?" Ellis, Martha said from the kitchen. It's a reasonable question, Silas said. He looked at the boy. Maybe when it's not 20 degrees outside. Okay, Ellis said agreeably, and went to investigate something else. Thomas came to stand near the kitchen doorway, the way he did when he wanted to say something and hadn't decided if he should. Martha knew the posture. What? She said. I can do real work, he said. You said that to him. I want you to know I meant what I said last night. I wasn't giving up. I was just saying what was true. I know, she said. I can do the work. I know you can. I just needed you to know that I know that. She looked at him, her son, 11 years old, already too serious, carrying weight he shouldn't have to carry yet. Thomas, go find out what needs doing and do it. That's all I need from you. He straightened slightly. Not much, but enough. And went. Clara appeared in the kitchen a few minutes later and stood beside Martha at the counter without saying anything. She was like that, Clara. Appeared beside you. After a while, she picked up a rag and started wiping down the counter without being asked. Is this all right? She asked quietly. Martha looked at her. What do you mean? Here. Staying here. For now, yes. Clara wiped the counter in slow circles. I like it quiet, she said. It's quiet here. Martha looked out the small window above the sink at the snow coming down soft and steady and thought that yes, it was quiet. Surprisingly so. We'll see, she said. Not as a dismissal, as a true thing. By the end of the first week, there were no longer any moments when Martha thought about whether she was overstepping. She'd stopped thinking about it by the third day, actually, when she'd found Silas trying to maintain records he clearly hadn't updated since October and offered to organize them. He'd looked at her the way a man looks when he's been rescued from something he didn't want to ask for help with, and she'd sat down at the table and spent an afternoon making sense of his expenses and income and the general disorder of a working ranch's accounting. You're good at this, he'd said, looking over her shoulder at the columns. I kept books for my husband. He was better at the dreaming part. I was better at the numbers. What kind of dreams? Oh, all kinds. A bigger farm. A mill. Once, for about 3 weeks, a steamboat. A steamboat. He had a gift for enthusiasm, she said, and didn't say the rest of it, which was that enthusiasm without follow-through had a cost that she was still paying. Silas had straightened up and not said anything, but he'd looked at her with something different in those gray eyes. Not sympathy, she was relieved to find, but something more like recognition. The look of a person who has also lived in the gap between what things were supposed to be and what they actually were. By the end of the week, Thomas had attached himself to the morning chores with a thoroughness that seemed to surprise Silas. The boy was up before light, following the rancher through the barn routine, feeding, mucking, checking on the 2 horses and the 4 remaining cattle, doing it without complaint or performance. Just doing it. Clara had quietly adopted the role of kitchen helper, appearing whenever Martha was cooking and working beside her without needing instruction. She'd also, Martha noticed, begun talking to the horses. Not in any dramatic way, just quietly, through the barn wall, the way she sometimes talked to herself. Ellis had recovered completely, which anyone who'd seen him sick would have found startling. He was everywhere at once. He had questions about everything. He had offered, at various points during the week, to help Silas fix a bridle, to help Thomas stack firewood, to help Clara with the horses, and to help Martha with the cooking, none of which he'd been particularly effective at, but the offers had been genuine. Does he always talk this much? Silas asked one evening, not unkindly, watching Ellis describe, in considerable detail, a dream he'd had about a bear. Since the day he started, Martha said. Silas said, which was not negative. She was learning, just processing. It was the end of the second week when the first neighbor appeared. He came on horseback in the afternoon, a man named Harold Fitch, who ranched about 6 miles down the valley and had clearly heard something he wasn't sure was true. He stood in Silas's kitchen with his hat in his hands and looked at Martha with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. Heard you had company, Fitch said to Silas. Mrs. Holloway and her children, Silas said. Wheel broke in the pass. Fitch's eyes moved around the kitchen, the clean counters, the organized shelves, the pot of something on the stove. Staying long? Until spring, Martha said. Fitch looked at her, then back at Silas. Until spring, he repeated. The pass won't clear until March, Silas said, in the tone of someone stating obvious geography. Right. Fitch turned his hat in his hands. It's just, there's talk, Silas. You know how people are. What kind of talk? Martha asked. He looked at her again, and this time the neutrality slipped just slightly. Not into meanness, but into the particular discomfort of a man who has opinions he knows he shouldn't say directly. Just talk about whether it's wise. A man taking in a family he doesn't know, strain on resources, and so forth. My resources, Silas said flatly. Of course, I just mean… Fitch stopped, tried again. People worry. People, Silas said, can worry about their own affairs. Fitch put his hat back on, said something vague about coming by to check, and left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Strain on resources, Martha said. Ignore it. I've heard it before. She went back to the stove. It's what people say when they mean something else and don't want to say it directly. Silas was quiet for a moment. What do they mean? She looked at him over her shoulder. I was genuinely asking, not performatively. He actually didn't know or wanted to see if she'd say it. They mean, she said carefully, that a woman my size is assumed to cost more than she contributes. That I'll eat the food and warm myself by the fire, and you'll get nothing out of it. The silence after that was very still. That's what they mean, she said again, in case it wasn't clear. Silas said nothing for a long moment. Then he said simply, They're wrong. I know they are, she said. It's nice that you think so too. She turned back to the stove, but she felt him standing there behind her, and she felt the weight of the statement, not as a kindness exactly, but as an acknowledgement. From a man who didn't give those away easily. It was enough. For now, it was enough. 3 days after Fitch's visit, 2 more riders came through. These ones didn't stop at the door. They rode past slowly, close enough to the window to be visible from inside, looking at the house with the deliberate curiosity of people who wanted to be seen looking. Thomas, at the window, watched them pass. Who are those men? He asked. Don't know, Martha said. They looked at the house a long time. Let them look. He turned from the window. Is it because of us? She considered lying, decided against it. Thomas would know, and knowing she'd lied would bother him more than the truth. Probably. Because of you, he said, not cruelly. He had a way of saying difficult things without intending them as weapons. Most likely, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Is Mr. Boone going to ask us to leave? She thought about the morning, about Silas at the table with his coffee and his steady eyes and the way he'd said they're wrong without hesitation. No, she said. I don't think he is. How do you know? Because he's not that kind of man. Thomas considered this. What kind is he? She thought about it. The kind who does what he thinks is right and doesn't particularly care what other people say about it. Thomas nodded slowly. Like Dad? She opened her mouth and then closed it. Because the comparison was kind, and she didn't want to contradict it, but it wasn't quite right. Her husband had been a man of good intentions and shallow follow-through, a man whose kindness was real, but whose commitments often bent when tested. Silas Boone, from what she could read of him in 2 weeks, was something different, harder in some ways, simpler in others. A man whose word, once given, probably stayed given. A little like Dad, she said finally. A little different. Thomas accepted this and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and Martha stood in the kitchen for a moment, thinking about the difference between the 2 men and what that difference meant, and whether it was a thing she was allowed to think about at all. She decided that was a question for a different season. For now there was supper to make and firewood that needed bringing in and a family to keep alive through whatever winter was planning to throw at them next. That was enough. That was, for the moment, everything. The writers who came to look didn't stop coming. Over the following week, Martha counted 7 separate occasions when someone passed the ranch on horseback or by wagon and slowed down long enough to make their interest plain. They weren't hiding it. That was the part that sat uneasily with her, the openness of it, the way people in small communities felt entitled to watch and weigh and discuss, without any sense that the person being watched might be looking back. She said nothing about it to Silas. He knew, she was fairly certain. He had the kind of awareness that came from years of living alone in a place where everything that moved was either a threat or a resource. He registered changes in his environment the way an animal does, not dramatically but completely. What she didn't know was how long his patience would hold. The morning that changed things started like most of the others. Martha was in the kitchen before light, working on a batch of bread that would last 3 days if they were careful about it, when she heard horses outside. More than one, moving with purpose, not the slow drift of someone passing to look. She went to the window. 4 riders. Dutton's horses. She recognized them before she recognized him. She put down the bread and went to the door and opened it before anyone knocked. Cal Dutton sat on his horse in the gray pre-dawn with his hat pulled down against the cold, and 3 men behind him who all had the particular posture of men who'd been told this would be simple. He looked at her in the doorway, and his expression didn't change. Boone around? He's in the barn, she said. Fetch him. She looked at him for a moment, just looked. I'll let him know you're here, she said, and closed the door. Silas was in the barn, as she'd said, working on a piece of tack that had been giving him trouble all week, sitting on a stool near the lantern with a needle and heavy thread. He looked up when she came in. Dutton, she said. 4 of them. He set the tack down slowly. What time is it? Early enough that he came before breakfast on purpose. Silas stood, rolled his sleeves down, and put on his coat without hurrying. She watched him do all of this and thought about the particular way a person moves when they've decided something before they've said it. The settled quality, the absence of deliberation. You don't have to go out there, she said. It's my property, he said simply, and walked past her toward the door. She followed. She wasn't sure why, except that it felt wrong to stand in the barn while it happened. Dutton watched them both come out, and there was a flicker of something on his face when he saw Martha beside Silas. Not surprise exactly, but recalculation. He'd expected to talk to Silas alone. Dutton, Silas said. Not unfriendly, not warm either. Silas, Dutton glanced at Martha, then back. Got a minute? I've got as many as I need. What is it? Dutton shifted in his saddle. This is neighbor business. Mrs. Holloway is staying on my property, Silas said. That makes it her business too. Dutton's jaw moved slightly. He'd been planning this conversation differently. All right, he said. Fine. I'll be straight with you. People are talking. You've got a strange woman and 3 strange kids living in your house, and we're not even through December. That's going to be a problem by February if the snow doesn't clear. Problem for who? For the whole valley. You run short, you come to us. That's how it goes out here. One man's bad decisions become everyone's burden. The word landed where he'd aimed it. Martha didn't look away from Dutton's face. She kept her expression neutral the way she'd learned to keep it. Not blank, not cold, just closed. A door that was not opening. I'm not running short, Silas said. Not yet. Not going to. Dutton tilted his head. You don't know that. You took in 4 extra mouths in November. I know what I took in, Silas said. I also know what I have. And I know who's been doing the work around here since December started, and it isn't only me. There was a pause. One of Dutton's men shifted on his horse. She's working, Dutton said, with a tone that suggested he'd heard the words but couldn't quite make sense of them. The bread you smelled when you rode up, Martha said. That's mine. The accounts your friend Fitch asked about the other week. I organized those. The fence line on the north side that needed mending, Thomas helped with that. Dutton looked at her. It wasn't a cruel look. It was something stranger. The look of a man confronting information that doesn't fit into the box he'd already built for it, trying to decide whether to rebuild the box or just ignore the information. I'm not here to argue with a... He stopped. With a what? She said. He didn't finish it. He was smart enough not to. But they all heard the shape of what he hadn't said, and it sat in the cold air between them like something that needed to be dealt with eventually. I'm here as a neighbor, Dutton said, redirecting, telling you what people are saying and suggesting you think about how this looks before it becomes a problem that's harder to manage. I appreciate the visit, Silas said, in a tone that did not suggest appreciation. I'll be thinking about my own affairs. Dutton held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. His men followed. They rode down the lane in a loose cluster, not hurrying, and Martha watched them go and felt the cold settling back in around her shoulders. He'll be back, she said. Probably, Silas agreed, and he'll bring more people with him next time. Likely. She turned to look at him. He was watching the riders disappear down the road with the steady patience of a man who has made his decision and is simply waiting for the consequences of it to arrive on their own schedule. Silas, she said, if this gets worse, if it causes you real trouble with your neighbors, I need you to tell me. I'm not asking you to announce it. I'm just asking you not to handle it without telling me. He looked at her. What would you do? Probably nothing useful, she said honestly, but I'd want to know. He considered this. All right, he said, and went back inside. She stood in the yard for another moment, looking at the empty lane, and then she went back to her bread. December deepened, and the valley pulled inward the way valleys do in serious winter, every ranch becoming its own small world, the roads passable some days and not others, the sky lowering until it felt like something you could reach up and press your hand against. The work increased, which was the thing that surprised people who'd never run a winter ranch. There was more to do in cold than in warmth, not less. Animals needed more food and more attention. Equipment froze and needed thawing and repairing. The firewood that had seemed sufficient in October started looking thinner in December. Every morning there was a new thing that needed doing, and every evening there were things that hadn't gotten done. Martha didn't try to do everything. That would have been foolish, and she'd survived too long by not being foolish. She picked the things she could do well and did them completely, and left the things that needed Silas's specific knowledge of the land and the animals to Silas. What she discovered over the course of that December was that the things she could do well were more extensive than she'd let herself believe for a while. She could manage food, which is a skill that sounds simple until you watch someone do it badly. She could look at what was in the stores and calculate forward, how many days this would last, where the shortfalls would come, what could be stretched and what couldn't. She'd been doing this math her whole adult life, in kitchens that had less than this one, and she was fast at it and accurate. She could also see the household in a way that Silas couldn't or hadn't been, which wasn't a criticism of him. It was just that he'd been alone long enough that certain things had stopped being visible to him. The corner of the root cellar that was losing heat through a gap in the foundation. The particular way the west window was letting cold air in at the seam. The saddle blanket that was developing a worn spot that would become a sore on a horse's back if it wasn't addressed. She brought these things to his attention without making them into productions. There's a gap in the root cellar foundation, she said one morning. Where? Northeast corner. You can feel the draft. Probably fine in October, but we're going to lose temperature in there before January. He went and looked, came back, got the mortar mix, and fixed it that afternoon. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect thanks. What she got instead was the sense that he was paying attention to her attention, which was more useful. Thomas was spending most of his days with Silas now, following through on the commitment Martha had sent him out to fulfill that first week, and then going beyond it. The boy had a natural mechanical aptitude that his father hadn't possessed, and that Martha had never quite known what to do with, and Silas seemed to recognize it. He started explaining things to Thomas rather than just directing him. What the adjustment on a particular piece of equipment was trying to accomplish. Why the cattle were fed in this order and not another. The way you read a horse's weight by eye when you don't have a scale. Thomas absorbed all of it without saying much, which was apparently the right response, because Silas kept talking. Martha watched this from a distance and felt something complicate itself in her chest. Gratitude, partly, and something more ambivalent. Her son was attaching himself to a man who wasn't his father, in a place that wasn't their home, during a winter they'd stumbled into by accident and desperation. She didn't know what any of it would look like in March when the pass cleared and they left. She hadn't let herself think much about March. Clara had found her own equilibrium, which was Clara's particular talent. She'd made herself useful in the kitchen, but the real thing was the horses. Silas had 2 horses, a sturdy gray mare named Fleet and a younger bay gelding he called August. And Clara had quietly established herself as the person who talked to them, checked their water, brushed them when the days allowed. Fleet, who Silas said was generally indifferent to people, had taken to putting her head over the stall door when Clara appeared. "She likes you," Silas observed one afternoon, coming into the barn to find Clara working the brush along Fleet's neck with the specific focus she brought to everything. "She's lonely," Clara said. "Fleet? She's a horse." "She's still lonely." Clara didn't look up from the brushing. She was probably with other horses before. Now it's just her and August is young and doesn't understand her. Silas looked at the mare for a moment. I had 4 horses, he said, 3 winters ago. Lost 2 of them to a sickness that came through. Sold 1 after. I'm sorry, Clara said. It was a while back. Still, she kept brushing. She remembers them. Animals do. Silas stood in the barn doorway for a while longer, looking at the girl and the horse, and then he went back to what he'd been doing without comment. But that evening at supper, he served Clara's plate first, which was not what he usually did. Martha noticed. She didn't say anything about it. The second week of December brought the Hartley brothers. They arrived on a Tuesday, which Martha knew because she'd been keeping track. She'd started marking the days on a piece of paper she kept in the room, partly out of habit and partly because in uncertain situations she needed the anchor of knowing what day it was. There were 2 of them, Ed and Roy Hartley, who ranched a spread about 3 miles east and who had apparently decided that Dutton's approach had been too subtle. They came to the door directly, knocked, and when Martha answered, they looked at her without any attempt at the neutral expression Fitch had managed. Ed Hartley was the talker. Roy stood slightly behind him and looked at everything except her face. Is Boone here? Ed asked. He's in the back pasture, she said. Do you want to wait, or should I tell him you came by? We'll wait, Ed said, and stepped forward as if to come in. Martha didn't move from the doorway. He stopped. It's cold, he said. It is, she agreed. A moment. You going to make us stand out here? I don't know you, she said pleasantly. Mr. Boone isn't here. I'm not in the habit of inviting unfamiliar men into a house where I'm alone with children. Ed Hartley's face went through several things in quick succession. We're neighbors, he said. I'd be happy to let Mr. Boone know you came by. Roy, behind his brother, made a sound. Not a laugh exactly, but close. Ed shot him a look. Tell him, Ed said tightly, that the Valley Association has concerns and we'd like to discuss them at the December meeting. I'll tell him. And tell him it'd look better if he came alone. Martha kept her face very still. I'll pass that along. They left. She closed the door and stood with her hand on the latch for a moment, breathing steadily. Ellis appeared from the back room. Were those bad men? Just men with opinions, she said. Same thing sometimes, Thomas said, from behind his brother. Martha looked at her elder son. Where did you hear that? Dad used to say it. She stood for a moment with the particular weight of hearing her late husband's words in her son's mouth, words she'd forgotten. And then she said, Your father had his moments. She went to write down the name of the Valley Association on the same piece of paper where she was marking the days. When Silas came in that evening and she told him about the Hartley brothers, he listened without expression and then sat down at the table with his coffee and was quiet for a while. Valley Association, he said finally. You know it? Informal thing. 6 or 7 ranchers who've decided they have authority over other people's decisions. He turned the cup. Dutton usually runs it. Are you a member? Used to be. He looked at the table, stopped going when they started talking more than working. They want you to come to the December meeting. I heard you. They said alone. He looked up at her. I heard that part too. She sat down across from him because standing while he sat felt like she was waiting for a verdict. What do you want to do? Haven't decided. What are the options, as you see them? He considered her. You want to talk through it. I want to understand what we're dealing with. He leaned back. Option 1. I go to the meeting. They say their piece. I say mine. Things stay roughly as they are. Option 2. I don't go. They escalate. Come in a larger group. Put more public pressure on. Option 3. I go and tell you what they said, and we decide from there. That's option 1 and 3, she said. What's different about them? Whether I make decisions before or after talking to you. She looked at him. He'd said it plainly, without particular weight, but the meaning of it sat between them like something real. Whether I make decisions before or after talking to you. You're not obligated to talk things over with me, she said carefully. This is your ranch. I know what it is. He picked up his coffee. But you're here, and what they decide about you affects you. Seems like you ought to know. She was quiet for a moment. All right, she said. All right, go to the meeting? All right, go to the meeting and come back and tell me what they said. He nodded, once, which she was learning was his version of agreement confirmed. Silas, she said. What do you think they're actually after? Not the stated thing, the real thing. He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't give reflexive answers. Dutton wants the north grazing land I've been holding. He's wanted it for 2 years. He knows I'm more likely to sell if I'm struggling. Having a family here looks to him like struggling, even though it's the opposite. Because he assumes I'm a drain. He assumes a lot of things. And the others? Some of them genuinely worry about valley resources and bad winters. That part's not dishonest. But it's also not about me. They've all got their own stores. It's about principle, about not wanting a precedent. What precedent? That you can take in whoever needs help without the group deciding if it's acceptable. He set down his cup. It's about who gets to make decisions around here. She understood that. She'd lived inside that dynamic her whole life. The way communities establish their authority over individuals, especially individuals who didn't fit the expected shape. A woman alone. A woman who was too large, too capable, too unwilling to apologize for existing. Then go to the meeting, she said, and don't apologize for anything. He almost smiled. I wasn't planning to. Good. She stood. Supper in an hour. What? He came back from the meeting on a Thursday evening with snow in his hat brim and an expression that was harder to read than usual, which was saying something. She waited until the children were occupied and then came to the kitchen table where he was sitting with his coat still on. How bad? She asked. Depends on your definition. He pulled off his hat and set it on the table. 7 men. Dutton ran it, like I said he would. A lot of talking about community responsibility and shared resources. Some of it reasonable, some of it dressed up resentment. What did they ask for? They didn't ask. Dutton suggested. He suggested it would be best for everyone if I made arrangements for you and the children to winter in town. She absorbed this. Town being Carver's Mill. About 12 miles east, there's a boarding house. Which costs money, she said, which I don't have spare, and which you definitely don't have. Did you say that? I said I'd consider it. He looked at her steadily. I didn't mean it, but I wanted to hear what else they said before I told them so. And what else did they say? That if I didn't make arrangements, they'd be less inclined to cooperate on shared water rights in the spring. Dutton's land sits upstream from mine on the East Channel. He paused. It wasn't a direct threat. It was the kind of thing you say so there's no record of you saying it. Martha sat with this. It was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. They were applying pressure, but they weren't doing anything that couldn't be dealt with, not yet. Water rights, she said. It would be a problem come spring. How much of a problem? Enough. He rubbed his jaw. Not unsurvivable, but enough to matter. She looked at her hands on the table. I should go, she said. Not dramatically. She said it the way she said hard things, flatly and plainly. If me being here is going to cost you your water rights, you don't have anywhere to go, he said. I'll figure something out. Martha. He said her name in a particular way. Not gentle, not commanding, just specific, present. Where would you go? She didn't answer because she didn't have one. The boarding house in Carver's Mill, he said, runs $8 a month for a family room. You've got $4.60, which I know because I found your coin purse on the kitchen counter on the second day, and I wasn't snooping either. She stared at him. I didn't touch it, he said, and I didn't tell you I knew because it wasn't relevant until now. That's... She stopped. That's a strange thing to have kept track of. I'm a practical man. I keep track of practical things. He leaned forward. Here's what I've decided. You stay. I handle Dutton. How? I have my own information about his water usage that he'd prefer the county surveyor not review too carefully. He said it without satisfaction, without pleasure, just a fact about the world. It doesn't need to become an issue, but he needs to know that it can. She looked at him for a long time. You've been holding that. I don't go into situations without something in my back pocket, he said. My father taught me that. Took me a while to learn it. And you'll use it, if I have to. Over me, she said. Over a family you've known less than a month. He met her eyes. Over the principle of it, he said. My land, my gates, my decision. Dutton doesn't get to run my ranch from 6 miles away." She was quiet. Something shifted behind her ribs. Not romance, nothing so clean as that. Just the recognition of something solid in a world that had been offering her a lot of loose ground lately. "All right," she said quietly. "All right, you agree, or all right, you're accepting it under protest?" "Both," she said, and he did smile then, briefly, contained, before looking back at the table. "I'll ride to Dutton's tomorrow," he said. "Should be resolved before Christmas." It was resolved before Christmas, though resolved was perhaps a generous word for a situation that went quiet rather than concluded. Silas rode to Dutton's, spent an hour there, and came back without telling Martha everything that had been said, which she accepted because she understood that some negotiations worked better when their details weren't circulated. What she gathered from the changed quality of the silence afterward was that Dutton had backed down, that the December meeting had been the high water mark of organized pressure, and that whatever Silas had said or shown had been enough. The riders stopped passing the house slowly. Fitch stopped by once more, in a different manner, less pointed, almost apologetic, complimenting the smell of the baking. She gave him a loaf, and he took it with the particular gratitude of a man who knows he owed something larger than bread. Christmas itself was quiet. There were no gifts. They were all too honest about resources for that. But Martha made a pie from dried apples and cinnamon she'd found in the back of the spice shelf, and Silas cut a small pine branch and Ellis decorated it with pieces of tin that caught the firelight, and they sat around the table and ate well and didn't talk about the spring and what it would bring. After the children were in bed, she sat by the fire for a while, and Silas sat across from her with a cup of something, and neither of them said much. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said after a while. She looked at him. "I was looking at the fire." "I didn't know you'd been married," she said. "Doesn't come up much." "What was her name?" "Ruth." He turned the cup. "Fever, same as nearly it took Ellis. Different fever, came fast." He paused. "The ranch went quiet after. I got used to it. Thought I preferred it. And now?" He was quiet for a while. "Now I'm less sure." She didn't push it. She let it sit the way he let things sit, in the space between two people where things can exist without needing to be named yet. Outside, the snow fell steadily, banking against the walls, covering the lane, softening the edges of everything. January was coming, and after January, February, and after February, eventually, inescapably, March. She'd stopped trying not to think about it. She was thinking about it quite a lot, actually, and what she was thinking was that Prospect Creek and a cousin she'd never met and an offer made 7 months ago in a letter felt like something from someone else's story. What felt like her story was here. This kitchen, this fire, this man she hadn't expected. She wasn't ready to say any of that out loud, but she was thinking it with the particular seriousness of a woman who has learned not to waste time lying to herself about what she wants. January arrived without ceremony. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in the first week and stayed there, the kind of cold that didn't feel dramatic after a while. It just became the permanent condition of everything, the baseline against which all activity was measured. Water froze in the troughs overnight. The barn door had to be forced open each morning because the hinges stiffened. Martha started wearing 2 pairs of wool socks inside her boots, and still felt the cold coming up through the floor of the kitchen in the early hours before the stove got going. She adapted. That was the thing about her that people who'd already decided what she was never bothered to notice. She was exceptionally good at adapting. Not gracefully, not without complaint, but completely. She adjusted and kept moving, which was ultimately more useful than grace. The children adapted too, each in their way. Thomas had developed a morning routine that ran parallel to Silas's with the uncanny synchronization of a boy who has been watching carefully and memorizing what he sees. He was up when Silas was up, dressed before Martha had the stove going, out the door with his coat on before anyone spoke to him. She'd stopped trying to make him eat breakfast before the barn because he wouldn't, and making it a battle cost more than it was worth. Ellis had claimed a corner of the kitchen as his territory. He'd moved a small crate there and arranged on it his particular collection of significant objects. A smooth stone from the road, a piece of harness leather Silas had given him, a tin button Thomas had found in the snow, and a drawing Clara had made of Fleet that was, despite Clara's young age, recognizably the horse. Ellis sat in his corner in the mornings and conducted conversations with himself and his objects, and the sound of it had become so familiar to Martha that she noticed when it stopped more than when it was there. Clara had gone quieter than usual, which with Clara meant nearly silent. Martha watched her and tried to gauge whether this was concerning or just winter, the way cold compresses everything, including children. Clara did her work, ate her meals, talked to the horses. She just stopped talking much to people. Martha brought it up once, carefully, sitting on the edge of the rope bed in the back room after the younger ones were asleep. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Clara was braiding a piece of fringe from her blanket. She didn't look up. "No. You're quiet." "I'm always quiet." "Quieter than usual." Clara pulled the braid tight. "I've been thinking." "About what?" A pause. "About what happens in March." Martha had been thinking about it too, in the small hours, with the wind pressing against the window. She'd been thinking about it and deliberately not settling on anything, because settling meant deciding, and deciding meant the thing became real in a way she wasn't ready for. "We'll cross that when it comes," she said. Clara looked up. Her eyes were her father's, that particular shade of brown that was almost amber. And she had her father's directness too, the quality of looking at you and meaning it. "I don't want to leave," she said. Martha held very still. "I know that might not matter," Clara continued, with the specific composure of a child who has learned to make preemptive peace with disappointment. "I know it's not our place. I know we can't stay just because I want to. I just wanted to say it." "It matters," Martha said. "Okay." Clara went back to the braid. "I just wanted to say it." Martha sat with her for a while after that, not talking, just being in the same room. It wasn't comfort exactly. She couldn't promise what Clara wanted to hear, but it was something, presence, which was sometimes the only honest thing you had. She thought about what Clara had said for the rest of the night. "I don't want to leave." Neither did she. She hadn't said it to anyone, had barely admitted it to herself in the direct language of a plain statement, but there it was, sitting inside her like a stone that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing the weight of it until someone else named it. She didn't know what to do with that yet. The storm that changed everything built for 3 days before it arrived. Martha knew it was coming the way she knew most things on the ranch now, by paying attention. The barometric pressure she couldn't measure but could feel, in the particular way the air thinned and then thickened again. The behavior of the cattle, who bunched at the south end of the pasture and stayed there. The sky, which had been doing something complicated for 2 days, building layers in the northwest that weren't clouds so much as weather being assembled. Silas knew it too. He didn't say much about it, which was his way. He said less when he was focused on something serious, not more. He'd spent 2 full days before the storm moving cattle closer to the barn, reinforcing the roof braces on the outbuildings, doubling the firewood inside the covered shed, checking every place where wind could get in and matter. Martha worked alongside him on what she could and managed everything else. She moved every root vegetable up from the cellar into the kitchen. She cooked 2 full pots of beans in advance. She refilled every water container in the house because they might not be able to get to the well for a while. "How bad do you think?" she asked on the evening before. Silas stood at the window looking northwest. "Bad," he said. "Days? Could be. Is there anything else we should do tonight?" He turned from the window and looked at the room. The children settled by the fire, the food stores organized on the counter, the water containers lined up, the firewood stacked inside to stay dry. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite satisfaction, because this wasn't a satisfying situation, but was something in the neighborhood of it. Acknowledgement, maybe, of work done before it needed to be done. "No," he said. "I think we're ready." The storm came in the night. Martha woke at what she guessed was 2 or 3 in the morning to a sound she'd never heard before. The whole house leaning into wind, a long structural groan that wasn't alarming so much as informative. It said, "This is serious." She lay still and listened to it and then got up and put more wood on the stove and checked the children. All 3 were still asleep, which told her either they were exhausted or children process information differently than adults, and probably both. By morning, the world outside the windows was white and moving. Not falling snow, but blowing snow, horizontal, the kind that makes distance meaningless. She couldn't see the barn from the kitchen window, which meant something given that the barn was 40 feet away. Silas was already up, had been for a while by the state of the stove. He was at the table with his coffee and his particular focused stillness. "The cattle?" she asked. "Got them in the barn last night, late. I heard the wind shift." He paused, barely made it back to the house. She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it, not dramatizing, which was not his way, but present with it. He'd been 40 feet from his own house in a whiteout. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Fine." He turned the cup. "Just took a minute." She poured herself coffee and sat down. "What do we need to do today?" "Nothing," he said. "That's the thing about a storm like this. You wait it out." "For how long?" "Until it stops." She looked at the window, at the white nothing beyond it. "And if it doesn't stop for a week?" "We have food for 3 weeks if we manage it right." He glanced at her. "Which you've already calculated." "Closer to 4, she said. "If we're careful." "Then we wait." They waited. Day 1 was bearable. Day 2 was harder. By day 3, with the storm still running and the walls of the house taking the full weight of wind that hadn't let up for 72 hours, the atmosphere inside had changed. The children were getting restless in the particular way of children who have exhausted their usual resources for occupying themselves and have begun looking at each other as both entertainment and irritant. Ellis, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, burst into tears over something so minor that even he couldn't explain it precisely when Martha asked. Thomas said something cutting to Clara about her drawing that he immediately looked ashamed of but didn't take back, and Clara went to the corner farthest from everyone and stayed there with her face turned to the wall. Martha led her. She was managing her own version of cabin pressure, the specific strain of being in close quarters with people she loved, while also being in close quarters, which was its own challenge regardless of who the people were. She was managing it, but it was management, not ease. Silas mostly disappeared to the barn during the day on the pretense of the animals, and she understood this was his way of giving himself and everyone else some room. She didn't begrudge him it. When he came back in the evenings, cold and smelling of hay and horse, he brought a kind of settled energy with him that seemed to have a moderating effect on everyone, including her. On the evening of the 3rd day, he came in and found her alone in the kitchen. Children dispersed to various corners, working through their feelings in whatever private ways children do. He looked at her face and said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "You look tired." "I am tired." He sat down. "What can I do?" The question surprised her. It was such a direct and practical question, so perfectly calibrated to what she actually needed from another person, rather than what people usually offered, which was either advice or sympathy, neither of which solved anything. "Just this," she said. "Just sit here a minute." He sat. She made tea and brought it to the table and sat across from him, and they were quiet for a while in the way that had become familiar, comfortable even. 2 people sharing a kitchen without needing to fill the silence. "Ruth," she said after a while, "did she mind the winters?" He looked at his cup. "She hated them," he said. "She was from Missouri, came out here with me and spent the first 3 winters telling me Missouri was better." "Was she right?" "About winters, yes." A pause. "About other things, she usually was too." "Did you tell her that?" "Not often enough." He set down his cup. "I was stubborn, still am." "I noticed," she said. He looked at her, and for once the gray eyes had some warmth in them. Not much, enough. "I imagine you did." "What would she think," Martha said carefully, "about you taking us in?" He thought about it seriously, which she'd asked it seriously. "She'd think it was right," he said finally. "She'd also have fed those men on horseback a lot better than I'm planning to." Martha almost laughed. She caught it before it got away from her. "She'd have liked your children," he added, looking at the table. Martha held that. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her in the weeks since Christmas, and it sat between them with some weight, neither too heavy nor too light. "Thomas would have driven her crazy," she said. "He drives everyone crazy eventually." "I like Thomas." "You're patient. He's a good kid." "He is," she said. "He's also impossible when he's decided he's right about something." "Where does he get that?" She looked at him. He was looking at her with that almost smile, the one he kept very close to the surface and only let out in small doses. "Don't," she said, but she was smiling too now, and they were sitting across from each other in a storm-besieged kitchen on the third night of a blizzard, smiling at the same quiet joke. And it was the most ordinary and human thing that had happened in months. What? On the fourth night, the knocking started. It wasn't the wind. She knew the wind by now, knew all its registers, the high whistle at the eaves and the low thrum against the walls, and the irregular slap of something loose somewhere on the barn roof. This was different, deliberate, a fist against wood. Silas was on his feet before she'd fully registered what she'd heard. He went to the door with his hand on the rifle that lived on the rack beside it, and Martha stood in the kitchen doorway with her heart moving faster than usual. He opened the door. A man fell in. Not dramatically. He didn't pitch forward like something in a stage play. He just lost whatever had been holding him upright and came down against the doorframe and then onto the floor. And the cold that came in with him was startling even to people who'd been living inside cold for weeks. He was a stranger. Medium height, broad through the shoulders, with ice in his beard, and the pale, unfocused look of a man who'd been outside in bad weather too long. He was conscious, barely, enough to say something in a voice gone rough with cold. "There's more," he said. "Road. There are more." Silas looked at Martha. She was already moving toward the coat rack. "How many?" Silas asked, crouching beside the man. "6. Maybe 8. Wagon lost a wheel. I don't know how long. I came looking for—" He coughed. "Saw your light." "From the road?" "Barely." Silas stood. He and Martha looked at each other across the room, across the fallen stranger, across the open door and the howling white beyond it. She read his face. He read hers. No conversation was needed because there was only one possible response to 8 people in a wagon in a whiteout, and they both knew it. "I'll take the rope," he said. "I'll get the beds ready," she said. He went back out into the storm with a rope tied to the door handle so he could find his way back, and Martha turned to the children, all 3 of whom had appeared from their various corners at the sound of the door. "Thomas," she said, "get the blankets from the back room, all of them." Who was that man? Someone who needed help. "Clara, I need the kettle on and the beans warming. Ellis?" She looked at her youngest, who was staring at the man on the floor with enormous eyes. "Ellis, come here." He came. She crouched in front of him. "I need you to talk to this man. Not about anything important. Just talk. Keep him awake. Can you do that?" Ellis considered the man with the seriousness of a child given a real task. "Yes," he said. "Good." She stood. "Then do it." She heard Ellis begin as she moved to start organizing. "My name is Ellis. What's your name? Do you want to hear about the rope I'm going to learn to throw?" And the man on the floor actually made a sound that was almost a laugh, which was exactly what she'd been hoping for. She was still pulling blankets when the door came open again, and Silas brought in the first of them. There were 9 in total. A family of 4, a man and woman, and 2 small children, the children wrapped in so many layers you could barely see their faces. 2 men traveling together who appeared to be brothers. A woman traveling alone, which was either brave or desperate, and possibly both. An elderly couple, the man barely mobile, his wife supporting him with the focused determination of someone who has been doing this for days. They came in over the course of half an hour, Silas making 3 trips into the storm with the rope as his guide, bringing 2 or 3 at a time. Each time the door opened, the cold poured in and Martha braced herself and kept moving. Moving blankets, moving food, getting people near the fire, assessing who was worst off. The elderly man was the most serious. His feet were wrong. She'd seen frostbite before, on her husband's hired hand 2 winters ago, and she recognized the color and the swollen stiffness. She got his boots off, and the woman who was presumably his wife made a sound that was pure anguish at what she saw. "I'll take care of it," Martha said. Not falsely. She didn't know yet if she could, but with enough certainty in her voice to stop the woman from spiraling. "Do you know what you're doing?" the wife asked. Her name was Agnes, Martha would learn. She'd been married for 43 years, she'd say later, and spent every one of those winters worried about this particular man's stubbornness about cold weather. "I know enough," Martha said. "Warm water, not hot. Slow. Don't rub." She did it. It took a long time and it hurt him considerably, which he bore with his eyes closed and his jaw set. And when it was done, she wrapped the feet carefully and elevated them on a folded blanket and told Agnes to keep them warm but not hot. "Will he lose them?" Agnes whispered. "I don't know," Martha said honestly, "but he has a better chance than he did 20 minutes ago." Agnes gripped her hand very briefly, hard, and then let go and turned back to her husband. The family of 4 had settled near the west wall, the father keeping it together through willpower, the mother nursing one of the children who'd woken from the cold and was crying in the thin, exhausted way of a child who's been frightened too long. Martha brought them beans and watched the mother's face when she first tasted the hot food. The particular expression of a person who has been running on nothing and suddenly gets something, and understood again why food mattered beyond nutrition. It was proof that someone had thought about your survival. The 2 brothers were fine, physically. Young and well-dressed for the cold, they'd been uncomfortable but not endangered. They helped Martha move things without being asked, which she appreciated. The woman traveling alone was named Vera. She was perhaps 30, sharp-faced, with eyes that took stock of every room she entered. She sat near the fire with her things pressed close to her and answered Martha's questions about her condition concisely. Cold, yes. Hungry, yes. Any injuries, no. And watched what was happening around her with the alert efficiency of someone keeping mental notes. "You run this place?" Vera asked, at some point in the organized chaos of that first hour. "No," Martha said, moving past with a stack of bowls. "You're running this," Vera said. Not argumentatively, just observationally. Martha didn't stop to answer, but she heard it. "What?" Silas came to her late in the evening, when the worst of the immediate exhausted calm that follows it. The house was full of people, sleeping or close to it, arranged across every available surface. The fire was stoked, the beans were replenished, the elderly man's feet were wrapped and elevated, and Agnes was asleep in the chair beside him. Silas came to find Martha in the kitchen, where she was calculating, as she always was, what they had against what they needed. "You're counting," he said. "I'm counting," she confirmed. He sat down. "How bad?" "It's not bad," she said. "Not yet." She turned to face him. "We have 4 weeks of food for 5 people managed carefully. We now have 14 people. That changes the math." "How much?" "A week. Maybe 10 days, if I'm very careful about how I do it." She paused. "And if the storm clears in 3 or 4 days, which you said you thought it might?" "I think it might," he said. "I'm not certain." "I know you're not certain, but what do you think?" He looked at the table for a moment. 4 days, give or take." "Then we'll be fine," she said, and heard herself say it with more confidence than she'd had 30 seconds ago, because hearing it out loud had organized it. 4 days, 10 days of food, even managed tight, that was a margin. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "More firewood inside tomorrow morning, if you can get to the shed, and—" She paused. "Those 2 brothers, can you find things for them to do? Active men with no purpose make problems." He looked at her with that particular attention he brought to things that surprised him, the quality of actually registering what had just been said. "You've done this before," he said. "Not exactly this," she said. "Close enough." "When?" She thought about it. "We had a fire on the homestead the second year, our house and our neighbor's house both gone. 16 people in the barn for 2 weeks in February." She picked up the counting paper. "You learn things." "What things?" "That people are mostly decent when they're scared, but decency needs a framework. Give people a job. Give them a role. Don't let them sit and stew." She folded the paper. "And feed them. Even if it's a small amount. Hunger makes everything worse." He was quiet for a moment. "You could run this," he said. "The management of it, if you want to." "I've been running it since the second one came through the door," she said, not with pride but with the plainness of a true statement. He nodded. "Then I'll get the firewood and the brothers, and you tell me what else you need." "Sleep," she said. "Eventually. We both need sleep." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. The storm broke on the 5th day, in the late afternoon. Not suddenly, but in the way big weather systems end, grudgingly, the wind dropping in stages, the snow shifting from horizontal to diagonal to falling straight and light and finally stopping altogether. The silence that followed was startling, the kind of silence that happens after prolonged noise and feels like its own event. Martha was at the kitchen window when it happened, watching the sky change, and she felt something in her chest release that she hadn't known was clenched. She heard movement behind her, the house coming awake from the particular exhausted sleep that had descended over everyone in the late afternoon. And then footsteps, and then Silas appeared beside her at the window. They stood side by side looking at the cleared sky, the first blue of it in 5 days. "There it is," he said. "Yes," she said. The guests, as she'd come to think of them, all 9 of them, plus her own 3 children, plus Silas, 14 people under one roof for 5 days, had been more than she'd feared and better than she'd feared at the same time. They'd been frightened and exhausted and occasionally difficult, and they'd also been, once given structure and purpose and food, genuinely helpful. The 2 brothers had become her most reliable laborers. Agnes had turned out to know more about preserving and stretching food than Martha did, which had been a genuine and welcome surprise. Vera, the woman traveling alone, had taken over the care of the 2 small children in the family of 4 while the mother recovered from the worst of the cold exposure, doing it with a matter-of-fact competence that suggested she'd been around children before, though she never said how. The elderly man. His name was Howard, and he was a quietly dignified man with a dry sense of humor that appeared in brief, surprising flashes, had kept his feet. They were painful, Martha could see, and would be for some time, but they were intact. He told her, on the morning of the 4th day, with Agnes pretending not to listen from the next chair, that he expected she'd saved more than his feet. "You should have come in out of the cold sooner," Martha had said. "My wife tells me that about everything," Howard said. "Your wife is right about everything," Agnes said from behind her, not listening. "Yes," Howard said, in the manner of a man who has known this for 43 years and has made his peace with it. Now standing at the cleared window with the storm finally done, Martha heard the guests beginning to move around the house with the specific energy of people who could see the end of the siege, assessing their things, talking about the road, trying to figure out what came next. The man who'd knocked on the door first, his name was Daniel, she'd learned, a carpenter moving his family west, came to find her in the kitchen. "We'll head out tomorrow morning if the road's passable," he said. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "What you and your husband did here." "He's not my husband," she said. Daniel looked slightly flustered. "Right, I apologize. What you both did, you'd have done the same." "I'd like to think so," he said, with the honesty of a man not entirely sure. "I'd like to think so." She gave him bread for the road, 3 loaves, which was more than she could easily spare, and exactly what she'd decided to give anyway. He took it with both hands, and the look of a man receiving something that costs the giver shab. By the following afternoon, all 9 guests had departed, in various directions, the road beaten down enough by the first travelers to be passable for the ones that followed. Martha and Silas and the 3 children stood in the yard and watched the last wagon diminish down the lane, and then were alone again, more alone somehow for having been so full. The house was a wreck. Not destroyed, just used, thoroughly, the way a place looks after it's housed 14 people through a 5-day blizzard. Blankets everywhere, dishes stacked, the floor tracked with mud and hay, and the general evidence of many boots. Ellis looked at the empty house and said, with genuine wistfulness, "I liked it when there were more people." "I know," Martha said. "Can more people come?" "Not by invitation," she said. Thomas was already carrying blankets toward the back room. Clara stood in the middle of the main room looking around at the disarray with her quiet assessment. "Where do we start?" Clara asked. Martha looked at the room. She felt tired in a way that went past the body. The specific tiredness of having been fully responsible for a situation and having it end well, which was its own particular exhaustion. "Dishes first," she said. "Then the floor. Then we sleep." Silas had gone to the barn. There was always something in the barn. But he came back in an hour and found the house considerably more organized than he'd left it, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it. "You didn't have to do all that today," he said. "I wanted to see the floor again," she said. He came in and sat down at the table and looked at her with an expression that had several things in it. The steadiness that was always there, but also something that had been building for 5 days of shared emergency and hadn't dissipated when the emergency ended. Something that was, she thought, trying to find its shape. "That woman," he said. "Vera. She told me before she left." He stopped. What? She told me she hoped I knew what I had here. He looked at the table. She meant you. Martha was quiet. I thought you should know someone else sees it, he said. In case you were wondering. I wasn't wondering, she said. Good. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down. I'm going to sleep for 10 hours. You've earned it. He stood, paused at the kitchen doorway. Martha. Yes. He turned. The lamplight was behind him, and she couldn't read his face fully, but she could hear it in his voice when he said simply, Thank you for all of it. She looked at him for a moment, this solid, difficult, decent man in his own kitchen doorway, thanking her as though she'd done him a favor rather than sheltered her children under his roof for months. You said 4 words to me in a snowstorm, she said. Don't thank me for what came after. He looked at her a moment longer than he needed to. Then he went down the hall to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands around an empty cup, in a house that was quiet and hers for just this moment, not by deed or title, but in the way that a place becomes yours when you fought alongside it through something. And she let herself feel, briefly and without apology, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't know yet how to make that permanent. She didn't know if permanent was possible, or offered, or hers to ask for. But she knew what she felt. And she'd stopped pretending she didn't. The word spread the way things spread in frontier communities. Not through any single channel, but through all of them at once, carried by the travelers who'd sheltered at the Boone Ranch and dispersed in every direction when the storm cleared. Daniel the carpenter told it at the first trading post he reached, 3 days after leaving. He told it practically, the way a man reports a road condition. There's a ranch at the base of the Sentinel Range, a woman there who knows what she's doing, 14 people through a 5-day blizzard without a single loss. He didn't embellish because he didn't need to. The facts were sufficient. Agnes told it differently. Agnes was a storyteller in the specific mode of a woman who has been married 43 years to a stubborn man and has developed the narrative skill that comes from needing to make people understand something they'd rather not hear. She told it to 3 different households in Carver's Mill during the week she and Howard spent there while his feet recovered, and she told it with the kind of detail that makes a story live, the way Martha had looked at Howard's feet without flinching, the way she'd organized 14 frightened strangers into something that functioned, the way the house had smelled like beans and wood smoke and been, improbably, warm enough. Vera told nobody anything, because that was Vera's way, but she'd left a note with the trading post owner at the Pass Road Junction. A single piece of paper with a name and a location, and the words, "These people are the real thing," which the post owner read and tacked to his wall because he wasn't sure what else to do with it, and it seemed like information worth keeping accessible. Martha knew none of this. She was too busy recovering. The week after the storm was the hardest single week of the entire winter, which was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the storm to be the hardest thing, and then the aftermath to be easier. What she got instead was a body that had held itself together under pressure, and then, once the pressure lifted, presented a very detailed accounting of everything it had absorbed. She was exhausted in a way that felt structural, not just tired, but hollow in places, like something load-bearing had been used up. She kept working because she didn't know how to stop, but she was slower. She made mistakes she wouldn't usually make, burning the edge of a batch of cornbread, losing track of a calculation she'd done a dozen times. Silas noticed without saying anything for 2 days, and then on the 3rd day put a cup of coffee in front of her in the middle of the afternoon and said, "Sit down." "It'll keep," he said. "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her, which he didn't always do in the middle of the day. "You've been running on empty since the storm broke," he said. "I'm fine." "You burned the cornbread." "That was an accident." "You don't have accidents in the kitchen." He said it simply, not as a criticism. "You're tired, deep tired. I've seen it before in myself after bad stretches." He paused. "Thomas can handle the morning barn with me. Claire's been doing the kitchen help without needing direction for weeks. You don't need to be doing everything today." She looked at her coffee cup. The thing about being told it was all right to stop was that it made stopping real in a way it hadn't been when she was deciding for herself. "1 afternoon," she said, "as many as you need." "1 is what I'll take." He shook his head slightly at her stubbornness. She could see him deciding not to argue about it. "1 then," he said. She slept for 3 hours that afternoon, which was something she hadn't done in the middle of the day since Ellis was an infant. When she woke, the house was quiet. Supper was on the stove. Done poorly, she'd see later, but done. And all three children were in various states of occupied and accounted for. Silas was at the table with his account books. She stood in the kitchen doorway, sleep-warm and disoriented, and he looked up from the books. "Feel better?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and meant it more than she'd expected to. He went back to the books. She stood there for a moment longer, watching him in the lamplight, and thought about how thoroughly her definition of safety had rebuilt itself around this man and this house over the course of 4 months. It was not a comfortable thought exactly. It made her aware of how much she had to lose, which she'd tried to keep from calculating. But it was a true one. She went and fixed the supper he'd started, and neither of them mentioned it. February arrived, and with it a change in the light. Subtle, almost insultingly so, given how long the dark had lasted, but present. The days were still short, and the cold was still serious, but there was something different in the quality of the afternoon sun on the snow, a suggestion rather than a promise. The ranch hands who'd been wintering at their own homesteads started appearing once a week to check in, and Silas began the mental shift toward spring work. What needed ordering, what fencing needed attention when the ground allowed, which cattle were likely to calve early. Martha watched him shift into this mode and felt the corresponding shift in herself, a loosening of the siege mentality that had governed everything since November, and beneath that loosening, the things she'd been not quite looking at. March. Prospect Creek. The cousin she'd never met. The offer made 7 months ago that she still didn't know was standing. Thomas brought it up first, because Thomas always brought up the things everyone else was managing not to say. He came to find her one evening when the younger children were already in bed and Silas was outside doing a last check of the barn. He sat down at the kitchen table with the deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing an approach. "Are we actually going?" he said. She looked at him. "To Prospect Creek? Yes?" "That was the plan." "The plan was from before," he said. "Before all of this." She sat down across from him. "Thomas, I'm not being sentimental," he said, with the specific forcefulness of an 11-year-old who has decided sentiment is a weakness and is therefore very sensitive to being accused of it. "I'm being practical. We have no wagon. We have no money to speak of. We don't know if the cousin will have us. We're going to leave somewhere that works to go somewhere that might not. That's not practical." "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since January." "And?" "And I think we should stay." He said it plainly, which was his way. "If we can. If Mr. Boone—" He stopped. "If Mr. Boone what?" Thomas looked at the table. For all his directness, there were things he still circled. "He's not going to ask us to leave," he said. "I know he isn't. He'd have said something by now if he wanted to." "Thomas, I'm not imagining things. I know what I see." He looked up. "The question is what you want. Because I think you know what he wants, and I think you want it too, and I think you're going to talk yourself out of it because you've decided you don't deserve it." The kitchen was very quiet. Martha sat with her son's words, 11 years old and seeing her clearly in a way she hadn't fully allowed herself to be seen, and felt something in her chest that was uncomfortable and necessary in equal measure. "That's a very adult thing to say," she said finally. "Dad used to say you were the most capable person he knew and the worst at asking for things," Thomas said. "I think he was right." She was quiet for a moment, managing what that sentence did to her. "Your father said that?" "To me. Not to you, obviously, because—" Thomas made a gesture that somehow conveyed the entire complicated personality of her late husband without words. "You know how he was." "I do," she said softly. "So?" Thomas said. "Are we going?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I hear what you're saying." He nodded once, in the manner of a person who has said what needed saying and is prepared to leave the rest of it alone. "Good," he said, and went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time after that, long enough for Silas to come in from the barn and find her there, and stop in the doorway when he registered the quality of the silence. "Thomas talked to you?" he asked. She looked up. "You knew he was going to?" "He told me he was going to." Silas came in and hung up his coat. "This afternoon." "He told you?" "Said he thought someone should, and he wasn't sure you'd do it yourself." He sat down across from her in the chair that had become over months of suppers and evening silences, his chair. He's not wrong. She looked at him. Silas, I'm not going to make you have the conversation before you're ready, he said. But I'll tell you one thing, and then I'll leave it. She waited. The ranch is better with you in it, he said. All four of you. It runs better. It feels better. He stopped, rubbed his jaw. I sleep better, if you want the small, honest version of it. He looked at the table. That's all I'll say. The rest of it is yours to decide. She sat with that. The specific plainness of it. I sleep better. From a man who didn't reach for words unless they were the right ones. I need a little more time, she said. You have it, he said, and got up and went to bed without any of the things people usually pile on top of an important moment to make it feel handled. She sat there until the lamp burned low. What pushed her to decide wasn't a conversation. It was a Wednesday. She'd ridden with Silas into Carver's mill for supplies, the first time she'd left the ranch in 3 months. And the specific quality of being seen again in a public place after that long was something she hadn't prepared herself for adequately. They went to the general store first. The man behind the counter, a Mr. Teller, round-faced and careful, looked at her when she came in and then looked at Silas, and she recognized the calculation happening behind his eyes. She was familiar enough with that calculation. It happened fast, and it had a lot of inputs: her size, her presence beside a known rancher, what he'd heard, what he thought he knew. He was polite. He was professionally, pointedly polite, which was its own kind of statement. She did the ordering because she knew what they needed, and Silas led her, standing slightly behind her in the way he'd developed of making space for her without making a production of it. She went through the list, discussed substitutions where things weren't in stock, negotiated a fair price on the flour. She felt Teller revising something as she spoke. Not his manner, he kept that professionally pleasant, but something behind it. When they were done and the supplies were being boxed, a woman came in from the back room. Late 40s, efficient, the kind of face that has spent time outdoors. She looked at Martha directly. You're the woman from the Boone Ranch, she said. Martha Holloway, Martha said. My husband's cousin was with the group you sheltered, the woman said. Daniel, the carpenter. I remember Daniel. He told us what you did. The woman's expression was uncomplicated. No calculation, no revision, just the plain regard of someone who has heard a true thing and wants to acknowledge it. My name is Francis Teller, a nod toward the man behind the counter. That's my husband. I didn't do anything remarkable, Martha said. Daniel's wife would disagree, Francis said. His youngest had a fever when they came in. You were the one who brought it down. She remembered that. The younger child, the long night, the cold compresses, Agnes helping. A lot of people helped. You organized the lot of them, Francis said. Daniel said you ran that house like a general. She said it admiringly, not critically. We've been wanting to say thank you to someone, and there wasn't a proper way to do it. Martha stood in the general store of Carver's Mill and absorbed being thanked by a stranger for something she'd done because it was the only possible thing to do, and felt the strangeness of it, how it sat differently than she'd expected. Not uncomfortable, not like pity, like being accurately seen. Thanks, Silas Boone, she said. He opened the door. Daniel said the door was your idea. She glanced at Silas, who was looking at the middle distance with the specific expression of someone choosing not to be part of a conversation. It was the only sensible thing, she said. Frances Teller pressed her hand briefly and let it go, and went back to her business, and Martha turned back to the counter where Mr. Teller was finishing the boxing of their order. He looked at her once more, and this time the calculation was done, and something had settled in his face that was, she thought, closer to respect than anything that had been there when she walked in. It wasn't the encounter itself that stayed with her on the ride back. It was what it meant, that the world outside the ranch had a version of her in it, now that she hadn't put there herself. That the 5 days of the storm had made something real and public and known, and people were adjusting their understanding accordingly. She turned this over in her mind the whole ride home, with the late February light slanting across the snow and the horses moving steadily, and Silas beside her not talking because he understood road time as thinking time. She found the letter on a Friday. It had been in the bottom of the box she'd brought from the wagon, a box she hadn't opened since arriving at the ranch because it contained the miscellaneous papers of her life, and she hadn't needed them. She opened it that Friday looking for the deed to the wagon, which she'd thought might be worth something even as salvage. She found the deed. She also found a letter, opened, dated April of the previous year, that she'd read once in the desperate, hopeful rush of that spring and tucked away and not read again. The letter was from her husband's cousin in Prospect Creek. His name was Gerald Holloway, and he had a homestead there, and he had written to offer her a place if she needed it, in the tentative specific language of a man who wants to be generous, but is making sure he's covered his obligations and no more. She read it now, in February, in a different state of mind than she'd been in April, and what she saw was different. "You and the children are welcome to come," he'd written, "and I can offer board in exchange for domestic help through the first year, and after that we'll see how things stand. Board in exchange for domestic help. A transaction dressed as generosity. And after that we'll see." The most loaded 4 words in the letter, leaving everything uncertain, leaving her entirely dependent on Gerald Holloway's continued goodwill and assessment of how things stood. She folded the letter and held it in her hands. She thought about what leaving actually meant. Not in the vague terms she'd been using, march, the pass clearing, what came next, but specifically, loading whatever they had onto a wagon she didn't own. 40 miles past the pass in early spring, when the road was mud and snowmelt and unpredictable, arriving at a cousin's homestead with 3 children and $4 and presenting herself as the domestic help. She thought about what staying meant. She was still sitting there when Silas came in from the afternoon work, and he saw the letter in her hands immediately. His eyes went to it the way eyes go to things that explain what they're seeing. "What's that?" he asked. "Letter from Gerald Holloway," she said. "My husband's cousin in Prospect Creek." He pulled off his coat. "Reading it again?" "First time properly," she said. She set it on the table. He was offering board in exchange for domestic help. Silas sat down. Read the letter where it lay without touching it, looking at it from across the table. When he'd finished, he sat back. "Domestic help," he said. "Yes." "That's what he wrote." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You were going to take your children 40 miles in spring mud to be someone's domestic help." "I didn't have another option," she said. "In April." "And now?" She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window, the last of the afternoon was going gold on the snow. "I want to stay," she said. Not tentatively. She'd been tentative long enough. "I want to stay here. I think it's the right thing, for me and for the children, and I think—" She stopped and made herself continue, because Thomas had been right about her tendency to talk herself out of things. "I think something has happened between us that I'm not imagining, and I don't want to leave without saying that out loud at least once." Silas held very still. "You don't have to say anything right now," she said. "Martha," he said. I mean it. You don't have to—" "Martha." He said it the way he'd said it before, that specific quality, present. "I'm not trying to stop you from talking. I just need you to know before you say anything else that there's nothing you're going to say that I haven't already thought." She was quiet. "I'm not good at this," he said, which was the most unnecessary sentence she'd ever heard him say. "I'm aware that I'm not good at it. I don't talk around things well. Ruth used to say I had the romantic instincts of a fence post." He looked at the table. "What I can tell you is what's true, which is that I don't want you to go, any of you. That this ranch has been something different since December, and I'm not interested in it going back to what it was before. And that—" He stopped, picked up the edge of the letter, and set it down. "I'm 51 years old, and I didn't expect to be sitting in my kitchen in February feeling the way I feel, and I don't have elegant words for it, but it's real." The kitchen was quiet. "Fence post," Martha said. He looked up, startled. "Your late wife wasn't wrong," she said. He stared at her for a moment, and then he made the sound. The real one. Not the contained version. A genuine laugh, brief and surprised. The kind that happens when something gets past the guard. She'd heard it maybe twice before, and each time it changed the whole shape of the room. "No," he agreed when it had settled. "She generally wasn't." Martha looked at the letter on the table, then back at him. "I'll need to write to Gerald Holloway," she said. "He deserves to know I won't be coming. I can take it to the post when I go to town, and I'll need—" She paused. "The children should have some stability, something settled. I'm not going to—" She stopped again, working out how to say it. I'm not going to have my children watch me build something informal and uncertain. If we're staying, it should be real. It should be said plainly and done properly when we're both ready. He looked at her steadily. That's a reasonable thing to want. Is it something you'd want too? Yes, he said. No hesitation. The fence post, it turned out, was perfectly capable of directness when the stakes were clear. She sat with that for a moment. We don't have to decide anything tonight, she said, but we've decided the main thing. We've decided the main thing, she agreed. He reached across the table and picked up the letter and folded it once and handed it back to her. She took it and held it for a moment and then set it aside because it was no longer relevant to what her life was going to be. March came in stages, as it always does. 2 steps toward warmth and 1 back toward cold, the ground giving up its frost reluctantly, the road through the Sentinel Range shifting from impassable to treacherous to merely difficult. By mid-March, the pass was technically open, which meant that the thing that had been holding the winter in place was gone, and the world the ranch existed in expanded back to include the valley and the town and the roads in all directions. And with that expansion came Cal Dutton. He rode up on a Tuesday morning, alone this time. No men behind him, no performance of casual authority. He came to the door and knocked, and when Martha answered, he took his hat off, which was different. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "is Boone here?" "He's in the barn," she said. "Do you want me to—" "I'll wait," he said, "if that's all right." She stepped back. He came in, which was also different from before. He stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands, looking at the room. The organized shelves, the clean floor, the general evidence of a household that had been running at full capacity all winter. And his expression was doing something complicated. She didn't offer him coffee. She wasn't ready to go that far. When Silas came in from the barn and saw Dutton standing in his kitchen, his face went still in the way it went still when he was reading a situation before responding to it. "Dutton," he said. "Silas." A pause. "I heard about the storm." "Most people did." "I heard about what happened here, the people you took in." He turned his hat. "Daniel Cooper's family was among them, I understand. His wife is Frances Teller's niece, so I heard about it from Frances." Silas waited. "I was wrong," Dutton said. He said it the way men say hard things, not easily, but without dressing it up either. "About Mrs. Holloway, about what I assumed. I was wrong, and I came to say it." The kitchen was quiet. Martha stood near the counter and did not say anything because she'd learned that some moments needed to proceed without help. "What changed?" Silas asked. Dutton looked at him. "What do you mean?" "You were wrong in December. You were wrong in November. What changed between then and now?" Dutton's jaw worked slightly. "I know what I said. I know what I meant by it." He looked at Martha. "You know too, I imagine. I'm not going to dress it up. I looked at you and I thought, what I thought." He set his shoulders. "I was wrong about what I saw. What kind of man I am depends partly on whether I can say that." Martha looked at him. Cal Dutton, who'd looked down from his horse and laughed, who'd blocked the road, who'd used the word burden in her presence without quite completing the thought. She could dislike him and still acknowledge when a man was trying to be honest. Those weren't mutually exclusive. "I appreciate you saying it," she said. "It wasn't forgiveness." He hadn't asked for forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement, and it was what she had. He nodded, put his hat back on, turned to Silas. "If you need anything come spring, labor, supplies, goodwill with the water rights, I want you to know the offer stands, no conditions." "I'll remember that," Silas said. Dutton left. They heard his horse moving down the lane, steady and unhurried. Thomas appeared in the doorway from the back hall. "Was that Dutton?" "Yes," Martha said. "What did he want?" "To apologize." Thomas considered this. "Did you accept?" "I acknowledged it," she said. "That's where I am with it right now." Thomas nodded, thoughtful. "That's fair," he said, and disappeared again. Silas was looking at her with that quality of attention, the one she'd learned to read over months of close quarters. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Mostly." She turned to the counter. "I need to finish the bread." He let her turn away, which was the right thing. She stood at the counter with her hands in the dough and worked it steadily, feeling the resistance of it, and then the give, and thought about the winter behind her and the spring in front of her, and what it meant that the worst thing that had happened to her in years had deposited her here, in this kitchen, in this life, with this man in the next room and her children's voices somewhere in the back of the house. She didn't have a framework for gratitude that didn't feel hollow, given everything the winter had cost. What she had instead was a plain and solid sense of what was real. The dough in her hands, the fire in the stove, the sound of Ellis explaining something at length to what was probably Clara, who was probably listening with her particular patient silence. The knock at the door that had come in the middle of the storm. 9 frightened people. Her own steadiness, which had surprised even her. Silas's voice from the other room, asking Thomas something about the fence line, and Thomas's voice answering with that specific tone he used when he actually knew the answer and was trying not to sound too satisfied about it. This was the life she had. She was going to keep it. The bread rose, and the afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor, and outside the window the snow was retreating from the fence posts in thin lines, and spring, real spring, was no longer something coming. It was already arriving, 1 inch at a time, the way every lasting thing does. Spring on the Sentinel Range arrived. The way hard things end, not cleanly, not all at once, but in fits and reversals. A warm week followed by 3 cold days, mud that froze overnight and thawed again by noon. The snow retreated from the high ground in patches, leaving behind the particular brown-gray of winter grass that hasn't seen sun in 4 months, matted and pale, and underneath all of that, alive. Martha noticed the grass first. She was crossing the yard one morning in late March when she saw it at the base of the fence post nearest the barn. A thin edge of green pushing up through the dead layer, maybe an inch, the color almost violent against everything around it. She stopped and looked at it for longer than made practical sense. Then she went on to what she'd been doing. But she thought about it for the rest of the day. That inch of green, the specific stubbornness of it. The ranch was changing with the season in ways that required constant adjustment. The cattle that had wintered in the barn needed to be moved to pasture in stages. Too fast, and they'd founder on the fresh grass. Too slow, and the barn would become a problem before the ground dried enough to manage it. Silas navigated this with the practical knowledge of a man who'd done it many times, but this year Thomas was beside him for every decision, asking questions that were no longer a boy's questions. They were a young man's questions, specific and operational, about why this and not that, what happens if, what do you do when? Martha watched them from the kitchen window some mornings and felt the complicated thing that comes from watching your child outgrow the shape he had when you weren't looking. Thomas at 11 had been a boy carrying a man's worry. Thomas at 11 going on 12, in the company of Silas Boone through a full winter, was something in between. Not yet a man, but no longer only a child. He stood differently. He listened differently. He'd stopped announcing what he knew and started using it instead, which was a distinction that mattered. She didn't say any of this to Silas directly. But one evening, when the children were in bed and she was at the table with a cup of tea that had gone cold, he came in from the barn and sat down and said, without preamble, "Thomas fixed the bridle latch today, the one I've been putting off for 2 weeks." "I know," she said. "He told me." "He did it right, didn't ask for confirmation." "No," she said. "He usually doesn't, once he's sure." Silas looked at the table. "He's going to be someone," he said. "He already is someone," she said. He looked at her. "You know what I mean." "I do," she said. "And yes, he is." They sat with that for a while, the comfortable silence that had become one of the things she valued most about this life, the absence of pressure to fill every moment with words. She'd been married to a man who couldn't tolerate quiet, who talked to fill it, whose voice had been the background noise of her adult life for 12 years. She hadn't known until it stopped how much of her energy that had consumed. This was different. Silas's silence was inhabited. It had weight and presence. Being quiet with him was not the same as being alone. The Valley Association meeting in April was Silas's idea, which surprised her. "The spring meeting," he said, one morning over breakfast. "I'm going." "All right," she said. "I'd like you to come." She looked at him. "To the association meeting?" "Yes." "The last time that group met, they suggested I be moved to a boarding house." "I know," he said. That's partly why I want you there." She thought about it. The old version of herself, the version from November, from the road, from years of calibrating herself to fit into spaces that hadn't been designed with her in mind, would have found a reason to decline, would have decided it wasn't worth the discomfort, that Silas could handle it, that she didn't need to put herself in that room. But she'd been fixing fence posts all winter, metaphorically and otherwise. She was tired of declining. "What day?" she said. The meeting was held at the Carver's Mill Community Hall, which was a large, drafty building that smelled of old wood and lantern smoke and the accumulated history of arguments about water rights and property lines. There were 9 ranchers present: Silas, Dutton, Fitch, the Hartley brothers, and 4 others she hadn't met. Their wives were not present, which told her something about how these meetings usually ran. She walked in beside Silas and felt the room register her arrival. She was practiced enough at this by now. The shift in attention, the calculations beginning, the hasty revision of expectations, that she didn't feel it the way she once had. She felt it, but it no longer destabilized her. It was simply information about the room. Dutton, to his credit, nodded at her directly. Whatever his apology in the kitchen had meant, it had apparently meant something because he made no visible show of surprise at her presence. The Hartley brothers were less graceful about it. Ed Hartley's face did several things in quick succession before settling on a careful neutrality that was not natural to it. Roy looked at the floor. She sat beside Silas at the long table and folded her hands in front of her and waited for whoever was running this to start. It turned out to be a man named Calloway, who she hadn't met, who ran a large operation on the south end of the valley and had the manner of a man accustomed to chairing things. He opened the meeting with the routine items: water schedule for spring, road maintenance contributions, the standing question of whether to extend the community fence line on the eastern boundary. Then Calloway said, "I'd like to add something to the agenda. Most of you have heard by now about what happened at the Boone Ranch during the January storm. I want to give that some formal acknowledgement." The room was quiet. 9 travelers sheltered 5 days, Calloway continued. No losses. Howard Gaines, who is known to some of you, would have lost both feet or worse without the care he received. He looked around the table. "This association talks a good deal about community values. I think we have an obligation to recognize them when we actually see them." Ed Hartley cleared his throat. "That's well and good, but I'm not sure what it has to do with the association." "It has to do with who we decide matters in this valley," Calloway said, plainly. "And I think this meeting is the right place to settle that question, since some of us expressed certain views on the subject back in December. The silence that followed was the specific silence of people who know they're being asked to account for themselves. Fitch, to Martha's mild surprise, spoke first. "I wasn't right about what I said in December," he said, addressing the table rather than anyone specific. "I came on behalf of neighbors who had concerns, and I let those concerns outrun my own judgment. I'd like to say that plainly." Roy Hartley said quietly, "Same." Ed Hartley said nothing, which was, she supposed, its own kind of statement. Dutton said, "I said my piece to Silas and Mrs. Holloway directly. I'll stand by that." Calloway looked at Martha. "Is there anything you'd like to say, Mrs. Holloway?" She hadn't expected to be asked. She looked at the faces around the table, men who had, in various degrees and with various levels of awareness, decided what she was before knowing anything about her. Some of them had revised that. Some hadn't fully, and wouldn't. That was people, and she was past expecting otherwise. "I'd like to say one thing," she said. "Not about December. About what I've learned." The room waited. "When the storm came in January, I didn't know any of those 9 people. I didn't know if they were good people or difficult people or people who deserved what I had to give. I just knew they were cold and there was room, and I had something to offer." She paused. "What I've come to understand is that the judgment about whether someone deserves help before you give it, that's the moment where things go wrong. You can evaluate after. But in the moment when someone needs something and you can provide it, the evaluation is a delay that costs more than it saves." Nobody spoke for a moment. "That's all," she said. Calloway nodded slowly. "Well said." He looked at his papers. "Let's move on to the spring road contributions." They moved on. The meeting continued for another hour, covering the practical specifics of valley life with the grinding thoroughness of community administration. She sat through all of it, occasionally consulted on something she actually knew the answer to, and at the end of it stood in the community hall doorway in the April light while Silas finished a conversation with Calloway and felt something she hadn't expected. She felt like someone who belonged to a place. Not welcomed. That was different, more passive, more dependent on other people's decisions. This was something she'd earned by being here through the winter, by the bread and the beans and the 5 days of the storm and the Dutton conversation and all the thousand small, unremarkable acts of competence and care that make up a life. She'd made herself belong here, which was the only kind of belonging that stuck. The letter to Gerald Holloway in Prospect Creek had gone out in March. She'd written it plainly. She would not be coming. She had made other arrangements. She wished him and his family well. She'd thanked him for the offer and meant it, because the offer had been real even if its terms had been thin. His reply came in late April, and it was short. He understood, he wrote. He'd heard something of what had happened in the valley over the winter. Word traveled even 40 miles. He wished her well. He added, at the bottom, in smaller writing that had the feel of something added after the letter was finished. Your husband always said you were the capable one. He was right, from the sound of it. She read this twice and then put the letter in the box with the other papers and closed the box. She hadn't let herself think much about her late husband over the winter. There'd been no room for it, no space in the constant press of survival and adaptation. But now, in the easier air of spring, she thought about him sometimes, about who he'd been and who she'd been with him. He had been a kind man, flawed in the specific ways of men who dream large and execute poorly, who mistake enthusiasm for follow-through. She had loved him. She had also, she could admit now, spent 12 years managing the gap between what he'd promised and what he delivered, and doing it in the invisible way that women manage those gaps, so that it looked from the outside like an ordinary life. He'd apparently known she was capable. He hadn't always trusted it. There was a difference, and she'd been living in that difference for a long time before she understood it. What she had with Silas was not a romance in the sense that stories usually meant no declarations on hillsides, no dramatic reversals, no moment where everything clarified in a rush of feeling. What she had was something built from the same material as the ranch itself. Practical necessity and consistent effort and the gradual accumulation of trust between two people who were both too experienced in the cost of impractical things to pretend something was more than it was. She respected him. He respected her. They had, over the course of a winter, become necessary to each other in ways that were not sentimental, but were completely real. That was more than many people got, and she knew it. She wasn't done being sad about the things that had been lost. The farm, her husband, the version of her life that was supposed to have happened. You don't stop being sad about those things. You carry them at a different weight. What she was deciding, in the late April of that year, was what to build on the ground she actually had. The conversation happened on a Sunday, which was the day the ranch ran slightly quieter and there was space for things that needed space. The children were occupied. Thomas had taken Ellis on his first proper ride around the south pasture, a thing Ellis had been requesting for 2 months, and that Thomas had finally, solemnly agreed to oversee. Clara was in the barn with Fleet and her consistent one-sided conversation. Martha was in the garden, turning the first soil of the year with a fork, the smell of it cold and rich and specific, the smell of something beginning. Silas came and stood at the garden edge with his coffee. "Ground's ready," he said. "Just about," she said. He watched her work for a while. She was used to being watched by now, used to his particular quality of attention, which was not passive but not intrusive, just present. "I want to ask you something," he said. She stopped and looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. "I'm not going to do this with a lot of words," he said. "You know I don't have a lot of words for things like this." "I know," she said. "You belong here," he said. "You know that. The children belong here. He stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. "I've known since January that this was what I wanted. I was waiting until the snow cleared to make sure you weren't just," he paused, "that you were choosing the place and not just choosing to not be in a blizzard." She almost smiled. "That's a reasonable thing to wait for." "Martha." He looked up. "Will you marry me?" He said it without a question mark, which was somehow exactly right. Not demanding, just stating a thing he was asking about, in the same plain manner he stated everything. She stood in the garden with the fork in her hands and the cold April air on her face and looked at this man who had said 4 words to her in a snowstorm and then kept his word in every way that mattered through the hardest winter she'd known. She thought about what she'd told the Valley Association. The judgment about whether someone deserves help before you give it, that's where things go wrong. She thought about the letter in the box from Gerald Holloway. She thought about Clara saying, "I don't want to leave," with the preemptive resignation of a child who has learned to make peace with disappointment. She thought about Thomas standing straighter when he was given a real task. She thought about the inch of green at the base of the fence post. "Yes," she said. No elaboration. He didn't need it, and she didn't have any that would have improved on the word itself. He let out a breath, one long, quiet breath, as if he'd been holding it for a while, which he probably had. "I'll need a ring," he said. "You don't need to spend money on a ring. It's what's done." "Silas, let me do this one thing the right way," he said, with the specific stubbornness that she had learned was as much a part of him as the steadiness and the gray eyes and the half-smile he kept very close. "Fine," she said, and went back to the garden. He stood there a moment longer, looking at her. She could feel it, the particular quality of being looked at by someone who is trying to hold a moment still. And then he took his coffee and went back toward the barn. She dug the fork into the ground and felt the resistance of it, and then the give, the cold soil turning in the morning light, and thought, this is what it is, not perfect, not clean. Not the story she'd started writing 12 years ago. A different story, harder in some ways, truer in others. With people in it she hadn't expected, and a place she hadn't planned, and a life that had been assembled out of broken things, and winter, and the stubbornness of green pushing up through dead grass. They were married in June at the Carver's Mill Community Hall, which smelled slightly better in summer than it had in April. It was not a large wedding. Martha had not wanted large. She'd had a large wedding the first time, and remembered it as an occasion that had been more about other people's ideas of what her life should look like than about anything real. This time, she wore a dress she'd made herself from blue fabric Frances Teller had pressed on her with an insistence that brooked no argument, and Silas wore his good coat that had been brushed within an inch of its life. And Thomas stood up with him, and Clara stood up with her, and Ellis sat in the front row and narrated the entire proceedings in a whisper to Howard and Agnes Gaines, who had driven the 12 miles from where they'd resettled near Carver's Mill specifically to be there. Howard's feet had healed. Not perfectly. He walked with a slight change in his gait that winter had given him permanently. But he walked, and he danced once, slowly, with Agnes, at the small celebration afterward. And Agnes's face during that dance was the face of a woman for whom the dance meant something that had nothing to do with the dance. Calloway was there. Fitch was there, with his wife, who turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman named Helen, who had clearly formed her own opinion of Martha some time ago and was simply waiting to say so in person. She said it directly. "I told Harold in December he was being an idiot, and I'm glad the outcome proved me right." And Martha liked her immediately. Dutton was not there, which was fine. His apology had been real, and his presence wasn't required. There were limits to what could be rebuilt, and Martha had no interest in performing reconciliation she hadn't actually reached. The Hartley brothers were not there either. Some things took longer than a season to change. Some things didn't change at all, and you learned to live around them the way you learned to live around a fence that was placed slightly wrong. It wasn't worth moving it, but you knew where it was. Summer opened the world in the way summers do at altitude. Not gently, but all at once, the green coming in fast and the light lasting until 9 in the evening. The ranch suddenly loud with the sounds that winter had suppressed. Birds, insects, water running in the creek that had been frozen since November. The cattle fat on new grass. August the gelding in the paddock in the late afternoon light, tossing his head at nothing in particular because it was warm and he was young, and that was apparently sufficient reason. Martha walked the fence line on the north side one morning in July, with Clara beside her, checking for winter damage that hadn't been visible until the snow cleared. Clara, who had been talking more in the weeks since the wedding. Not dramatically, she was still fundamentally Clara, but the quiet had a different quality. Less like withholding and more like choosing. "Is it different?" Clara asked, about halfway along the fence line. "Is what different?" "Being married, again." Martha considered this. She owed Clara honesty. She'd always owed her children honesty, which was a harder standard than most parents managed. "Yes," she said. Different in ways I didn't expect. Good different or just different? Mostly good. She stopped at a post that was listing slightly. Different because I'm different. I was 22 the first time. I didn't know what I was making a decision about. Clara crouched and looked at the post. This one needs resetting. I see it. I can help. After breakfast tomorrow, Martha said. Clara stood. Do you think Dad would have minded? She asked. This. The question was so like Clara, direct in the places other people circled, delivered without drama or agenda. Martha stood in the July morning with the fence line stretching away in both directions and thought about how to answer it honestly. I think your father would have wanted us to be all right, she said. I think he would have felt complicated feelings about the specifics. He was human. It would have been a complicated thing for him. She paused. But I think the part of him that loved us would have been glad. Clara nodded slowly. That's what I thought, she said, and went on down the fence line, and Martha followed, and they checked the rest of the posts in the comfortable quiet that was one of the things she loved most about this particular child. By the fall, the stories about the winter were becoming something else. Not legend exactly, but close to it. The way a true event becomes, in retelling, a kind of instruction. She heard versions of it in town, at the store, from Frances Teller, or Helen Fitch, or people she barely knew, and was always slightly startled by what the story had become in other people's mouths. In some versions, she was more heroic than she'd been. In others, more saintly. One version she heard had 15 travelers, not 9, and a child born during the storm, which had not happened. She didn't correct the version she overheard. They weren't her stories anymore. They belonged to the people telling them, who needed from them what they needed. A story about what people were capable of when things went wrong, about what kindness could accomplish, about the possible. What she knew, that the stories didn't capture, was how frightened she'd been, how uncertain, how close she'd been, on night 3 of the storm with 9 people in the house and food calculations running through her head at 2 a.m, to genuine panic. What she'd done wasn't heroic in the way the stories made it. She'd done what the situation required and what she was capable of, and she'd been afraid while doing it. That was she'd come to understand what competence actually looked like from the inside. Not the absence of fear, just the decision to keep moving anyway. The valley didn't fully become the place the stories said it was. Communities don't transform completely. People don't shed their worst instincts because of one winter. The following November, a family came through the pass in difficult circumstances, and 2 ranchers turned them away before a third took them in. Martha heard about it and felt the specific anger of a person who knows what the right thing is and watched someone not do it. She went and found the family herself and brought them to stay for 3 days until the road cleared, and Silas said nothing about it because he'd expected she would. You can't fix all of it, he said one evening. I know, she said, but you're going to keep trying. Aren't you? He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I suppose I am. That was the truth of it, and she knew it. You couldn't change a valley. You could change what happened inside your own fence line, and who you let through your own gate, and what you did in the hours that were actually yours to act in. The rest of it, what other people chose, how slowly judgment changed, whether the stories that circulated made any real difference in anyone's behavior, that was outside your control, and you had to make peace with it. What you had was the gate. What you had was the decision, made again and again, about who you were willing to be. Thomas turned 12 in October, and Silas gave him the responsibility of the morning barn round without supervision, which Thomas received with the careful non-expression of a boy trying very hard not to look pleased. He went out the next morning 40 minutes before he needed to, and came back having done everything, and didn't say a word about it at breakfast. Martha watched him eat and thought about November, about the road, about the boy who'd said there's nothing next in the flatly honest tone of a child who's been carrying too much too long. He'd been right in November. There had been almost nothing next. The almost was everything. Ellis had learned to throw a rope. He was terrible at it, technically, but absolutely committed, and Silas had developed a specific patience for Ellis that Martha found quietly moving. The way he watched the boy's unsuccessful attempts with the same focused attention he gave everything, waiting for the moment when the instruction would actually land. He'll get it, Silas said one evening after a session in the yard that had resulted in the rope landing on everything except the post. When? She said. When he's ready. That's not a timeline. No, he agreed. It isn't. Clara had started drawing in earnest, not just Fleet, but everything. The mountains, the fence line, the view from the kitchen window, Thomas's hands while he worked. She filled pages with the specific quality of observation that had always been her particular gift, and Martha recognized in the drawings the same thing she recognized in the girl herself, a person who saw the world accurately and recorded it without sentimentality. She'd taken the drawings once to show Frances Teller in town, and Frances had looked at them for a long time without speaking. "How old is she?" Frances had asked. 8, Martha said, "almost 9. "These are real drawings," Frances said. "Not as a compliment exactly, as an assessment." "I know," Martha said. She didn't know yet what to do with that knowledge. She suspected she'd figure it out the same way she'd figured out everything else, by paying attention to what was real and following it where it led. The first snow of the new winter came in November, as it always did, and this time Martha was ready for it, in the way you can only be ready for something after you've survived it once. She'd put up provisions through September and October with a deliberateness that Silas had observed and occasionally helped with, and never questioned. She'd organized the root cellar herself, cross-referencing against what had run low the previous January, and planning accordingly. She'd checked the window seams and the foundation gap, and the barn roof braces, and the firewood, and the water situation, and the condition of the road through the pass. She'd also put together a box, a small wooden crate that sat near the door, stocked with blankets, dried food, and basic medicines. For whoever came. Because someone would come. The pass would do what passes do, and someone would be caught in it, and they would see the light from the ranch house the way Daniel had seen it, and they would make for it. She wasn't afraid of that anymore. She was in some way she couldn't have explained to anyone outside of it, ready for it. On the first evening of the first snow, the family sat at the kitchen table, all 5 of them, which was what they were now, the 5 of them, and this house, and this life, and ate supper in the lamplight while the snow came down outside, and Ellis talked without stopping about something involving a rope and a theoretical bear. And Thomas ate with the focused efficiency of a boy who had worked hard all day. And Clara drew on a piece of paper beside her plate, the drawing materializing under her hand with the quiet certainty of something that had always been there. And Silas sat at the head of the table and looked at the room around him with an expression Martha had come to recognize. He looked like a man who understood what he had. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said that wasn't already in the room, already between them, already as established as the fence posts and the root cellar and the gate at the end of the lane. Outside, the snow fell on the Sentinel Range and the valley below it, on the pass road and the high ground and the brown grass that would be green again in April. Always again in April, the green coming back the way it always came back. Not because it was promised, but because that was what it did, the stubborn, unglamorous, entirely reliable thing that life did when you gave it half a chance. She thought about a woman on a broken road in November. She thought about 4 words spoken by a man on horseback in the snow. She thought about all the ways the smallest moments become, without warning, the ones that change the direction of everything. You can't know them at the time. That's the part nobody tells you. The moment that rewrites your life doesn't arrive with any announcement. It arrives as a wheel hub cracking in the cold. It arrives as a stranger slowing his horse and looking at you for a long moment before climbing down. It arrives as 4 words. What you do with those words, how you honor them, how you build on them, how you decide every day afterward to be equal to the life they opened, that's the part that belongs to you. Martha Holloway Boone looked at her family in the lamplight, listened to the snow on the windows, and felt, without sentimentality and without reservation, the plain solid weight of a life that was hers. She had carried a great deal to get here. She would carry more before she was done, but she would not carry it alone. And that, quiet, unromantic, hard one, was everything.